WTO, and it's 4:31 in Geneva. And we are going to start this hybrid session with 4 panelists, one panelist with me, Jennifer Hillman, 3 panelists on screen, Andre Sapir, Chad Bown, and Justin Lin. And we're going to speak about a topic that keeps at least 2 of the people involved in this panel awake at night, and that's Jennifer and myself. And I wonder whether that's also the case for Andre, Chad, and Justin. But before I go to this, the title of this session is Government Support, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And for those of you who like to, who are more used to using the term subsidies, this is about subsidies in international trade and subsidies and the multilateral trading system. My name is Marion Janssen. I'm the director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. We at the OECD have been working for many years on issues related to subsidies. I joined the OECD only 1 year ago, but I've already at multiple occasions said this is one of the most frustrating topics that the OECD has been involved in. We have notably for over 2 decades been publishing data on public support in the agricultural sector. Each year we launch the numbers, each year we say hundreds of millions of dollars spent in this sector, and many of these are spent in a way that distorts trade, and that is not good for farmers, neither for the environment. A bit has changed over those 2 decades, but not a lot. I'm happy to have with me today 4 speakers who know this topic of subsidies and government support very well. And I will introduce them in the order in which I will ask the first question to them, because we will try to have a hybrid and interactive session here today. The first question will be asked first to Chad Bown. Chad Bown, a former colleague of mine at the WTO, very well known to many of you as the man behind Trade Talks, the podcast on trade, as he receives with a smile. Chad was known before, and when he had his very distinguished academic career, very much because of his research on the issue of anti-dumping, and that topic has also a relationship with prices, subsidies, distortions, and how do we handle with this, deal with this. But above all, because of Trade Talks, Chad has a fantastic, very broad view on what is going on in the trade world right now. And I look forward to your intervention today, Chad. I will then move to Justin Lin. Justin Lin was formerly the chief economist at the World Bank, and at the time published around 10 years ago a paper on industrial policy. And 10 years ago, that was a revolution for somebody working in Geneva. Justin, what was a revolution at the time is a topic that is being discussed very frequently currently all around the world. You, in your current position as Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics in Beijing, I would be very well placed to give us a view on this topic and the role it has currently. Andre Sapir, professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and senior fellow at Bruegel. Andre, you're based in Belgium. You are based in Brussels, the core of the European Union, and you recently published a book on China and the WTO. And I expect that we will hear today that China and the WTO is a topic that is very much related to the topic of subsidies and the WTO. And I therefore very much look forward to your intervention today. And then with us today, Jennifer Hillman. Jennifer, you were a judge on the appellate body, former appellate body. You dealt notably with the Boeing case. That case and also the Airbus case were cases that dealt a lot with the issue of subsidies. You're an absolute legal aspect on the topic today, senior fellow for trade and international political economy. And at the Council for Foreign Relations, I look forward to hearing from you on government support. First question, Chad. The subsidies agreement has been around for decades. So we knew at the WTO that subsidies matter for international trade. Subsidies have been disciplined in agriculture, not so much yet in fisheries. We are discussing them now for the industrial sector. We have had cases that have dealt with subsidies. How do you assess the current situation around the topic of government support? Is there anything new right now? Why is this topic important for us today?
So thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. And just so everybody knows, at one stage or another, I worked for Justin when I was at the World Bank, but I've basically worked for everybody that's on this panel at some point. They've all been my boss at one point or another. So it's a pleasure to be with you. So as Marion, as you mentioned, back in the day, when we started the global anti-dumping database, we quickly realized that that was only one of the trade remedies, trade defense instruments that countries were using. And then another really big one and growing one was countervailing duties, these anti-subsidy tariffs. So we had to relabel the database, the temporary trade barriers database, to make sure we were capturing that as well. But I think to your specific question, there are elements of the pandemic and events over the last 2 years that have introduced new cases for subsidies that we have seen proliferate. And so I think it's important to get those onto the table. I think they're very different, at least from the countries that have been using them from their perspectives. And here I'm going to talk primarily about my research, which is focused largely on what the United States and perhaps to a lesser extent Europe have done here. These are maybe some of the arguments about national security and stockpiling and things like that other countries have used in the past. But I think they've suddenly become of interest to richer countries as well. And so let me give you 3 specific examples where this has come up. One is on personal protective equipment, some medical supplies. Second is on semiconductors. Third is on vaccines. And I'll try to go through them very quickly just to kind of set the stage. And for each of them, I think what one thing they have in common, the argument is the need for diversification. That in a world with lots of potential new shocks, whether it's climate, whether it is geopolitical shocks, whether it is pandemics, that we need increased diversification for certain products in certain supply chains that we've never really thought about before, right? And so for the example of personal protective equipment, the story is roughly, everybody knows it, right? The hits first in China. China is the place where there's a lot of residual global supply. 50 to 60% of world exports of most PPE, a number of PPE products are coming out of China. And so when China's hit first and the rest of the world needs that PPE and they would access it through trade, it just kind of wasn't there, right? So there's an argument, sort of a diversification argument that you can make for subsidies that might move some of that residual supply that the world might need for certain medical goods out of that particular geographic location. I think you could make similar arguments for things like semiconductors. For some reason, maybe it was subsidies in the past, maybe it's the location of demand for end users of a lot of semiconductor products, whether it's consumer electronics or companies and the like, moving to Asia, settling in Asia. The fact that so much manufacturing capacity is now installed in Taiwan, South Korea, suggests that there's vulnerabilities there. Now, this has nothing to do, I don't think, with the subsidies that are being proposed in the United States or Europe at the moment, but I think you can make the arguments that some additional diversification there is needed as well. The final example would be on vaccines. And here we've seen really excessive concentration of manufacturing in the United States, Europe, China, and India. And that's obviously meant that the rest of the world hasn't gotten vaccinated nearly quickly enough, hasn't been able to access doses of vaccines because the countries where that production has been located have largely hoarded them for themselves, arguably for political reasons, right? And so there's arguments for diversification there. So I think those are the 3 that I would start with. One final one that I want to put out there, just as kind of somebody that's looked at these supply chains, is new issues of subsidies in the context of vaccines that have come up. What do you do in a world of global supply chains where to really scale up some of these goods very, very quickly, you need to not only get governments to subsidize the end manufacturing facilities, right? Which many of them did through advanced purchase contracts or the Operation Warp Speed in the United States. But what happens when you also need to subsidize the input suppliers of raw materials and all of the critical goods? And those happen to be located in different countries because we now have global supply chains. Coordinating the need to subsidize in emergencies is a non-trivial element as well. Anyway, so this is just to say, in our world of thinking about subsidies, I think we need to start to think flexibly about not necessarily rules, but thinking through not only disciplines on subsidies, but how to help governments think through ways to encourage them and do them the right way in times of emergency that we haven't necessarily thought about too hard before.
Thank you, Chad. And I forgot when I introduced you to say that you are speaking to us from Washington. You are working at the Peterson Institute. I look forward to hear on your points from an economic point of view on subsidies in these crisis situations from our other speaker here who came from Washington to Geneva, Jennifer. But before moving to Jennifer, Justin, I think I heard Chad make reference to subsidize to diversify, and even a small reference to subsidize to reach scale. That sounds a bit like an infant industry argument to me. Justin, from Washington to Beijing, what's the situation?
Well, as you mentioned, the topics is the good, the bad, the ugly. I'll start with the bad. The reason why subsidies are necessary is because the country want to produce something they do not have competitive advantages. And since they do not have competitive advantages, firm will not be viable in an open competitive market. And under the kind of situation, the government either will have to close the economy and to produce everything domestically with a very high prices. Certainly that will be very inefficient. Or continue to remain open, but we'll have to give subsidies to the producers in order to survive in the economy. And no matter what cases it is, certainly the cost will be high, and so subsidy is bad, because you want to go to sectors which you do not have competitive advantages. And this can turn into ugly, because once you started to give subsidies, then the subsidy will be captured and become forever. And the cost will be increasingly high. Rent-seeking will set in, corruption will be set in. And under that situation, subsidies will turn from bad to ugly. But as you mentioned, 10 years ago, I started to write something about the necessity of industrial policy. But in the kind of industrial policy, I argue, if a developing country want to turn sectors, which they have latent competitive advantages, but which are not the competitive advantage of the economy, under that kind of situation, you need to give some incentive to the first movers. And this kind of incentive does not have to be big. This kind of incentive can be short-term. And if you provide those kind of incentive to the first movers, either domestic firm or foreign direct investment, to help you to turn the sector which you have the latent competitive advantage to become actual competitive advantages, and then turn that into the competitive sectors of the economy. Then that kind of situation is a short-term firms of subsidies can be good. And I think a developing country should follow this kind of industrial policies, and developing country should not follow the subsidies that you describe. In European country, you subsidize every cow €2 every day, and you subsidize farmers in sector which you do not compare advantages, And now people use the similar means to try to, you know, in the name of diversification or in the name of national securities. I think that those kind of things will, you know, make the world trade system to collapse, and the country will have to pay very high cost, and we should avoid that. And a situation like the personal protective equipment, certainly, if you are wrong, if you are hit by some kind of, you know, unexpected shock in the short run, you may run out of certain kind of supply. But the way to cope with that is to improve the international trading system instead of try to produce everything by yourself. And so I think that, you know, your title of Good, Bad, and Ugly is a very good description about, you know, what kind of industrial policy, what kind of government support will be desirable, and what we should avoid.
Thank you very much, Justin. I found very interesting your reference to capture when you were talking about ugly subsidies, ugly government support. Also very important, probably in the current context, the notion of time restrictions on interventions. How long does a policy stay in place? But above all, you made a perfect link to the next speaker by speaking about European cows. Andre, in your book, I'm not sure whether you wrote about cows, but you did describe, I remember, that the role of governments in the national economy has played a role at several moments in time for the GATT and for the WTO, and is also one of the issues under discussion when the relationship between China and the WTO is discussed. Andre, please, what is the situation today when it comes to subsidies or government support?
Thank you, Marion, and thank you for having been in this great panel. So I don't want to make my presentation or my discussion really centered on China. I want China to be a part of this discussion, but not the full extent of my intervention. And I would, on the whole, I would very much agree with what Justin has said. There is good in subsidies, and you know, as an economist, and I think we all agree that subsidies do have a role to play in certain cases, in particular in activities where social benefits are larger than private benefits, when there are, you know, what we economists refer to as externalities and positive externalities. So when the private sector is under providing particular goods or services, there is clearly a role. And I think I would say that is the good kind of subsidies in order to increase the supply by the private sector. I think that we have entered into, and I agree there with Justin, in a bad equilibrium. And I'm worried that, you know, what Chad said, and to which I broadly agree as well, you know, what has happened in times of emergency. I think that the times of emergency that apply to PPE, to you know, medical products in the spring of 2020, that applies today to the vaccines, is now being used in a number of other sectors. And Chad, you talked about semiconductors, and you have written really great pieces on that. So I think there's something else going on, and I think it's bad, and it's even getting quite ugly. And I would put this in a sense to a situation where we are in a non-cooperative game. I mean, after all, WTO rules are precisely designed to nudge countries to play a cooperative game by signing up to certain rules. I think this has become quite difficult in some domains, and I think you're right that the crisis, and certainly the fact that public expenditure in general in most countries have increased hugely. There's sort of basically at the moment no budget constraints. Before it would be finance ministers that would intervene and say, hey, wait a second here. There is such a thing as a budget constraint, and more than perhaps WTO rules, it would be those budget constraints that would play a role, and the WTO rules would sort of complement the budget constraint. At the moment, we don't see any of that sort. And yes, I think we have been, and that I think is the very unfortunate situation, and we have seen the way the world has handled the pandemic in a non-cooperative manner. So I think what we are observing in the subsidies field is a reflection of something much broader. And I think both Justin and Chad referred to geopolitics. I think this is indeed the world we are in. We're in the world of geopolitics rather than the world of purely economic argument. So, the economic argument for subsidies, yes, they are there to some extent. But once you enter a different world, the world of geopolitics, then indeed you enter into the bad and maybe even the ugly. Now, I would just say that just to finish on this, on China, there is nonetheless, besides what I've just said, and I think that's referring to the book that we wrote with Petros Mavroidis, I think there is also a difficulty in the WTO, in the sense that not all WTO members operate according to the same economic principles. And there, I think probably we'll continue that discussion, is the issue of the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and the subsidies that are associated or may be associated with state-owned enterprises. That, I think, is an issue in and of itself that needs to be discussed, and a solution needs to be found to that. Let me stop here.
Thank you, André. Well, you brought very different concepts into the discussion. We are in a situation where budget constraints don't seem to exist anymore. No limits to monetary creation. You use the terms non-cooperation and geopolitics. I would like to invite you all to get back to this in the third round of the discussion. But maybe before we go into that, Jennifer, I would like to get maybe some of your views on what you heard, but also on this distinction between the good, the bad, and the ugly. And before I give you the floor, just for the audience, to give you a sense on how difficult I found in my professional life to make that distinction. And I think definitely the experts involved in dispute settlements have been exposed to this kind of problems. I was in the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis working for another agency for the International Trade Center. We were caring a lot about small and medium-sized enterprise and their competitiveness. And when the crisis hit, our advice to governments was provide temporary support to your small and medium-sized enterprises. They may need that to survive. And I thought we were doing good. But very rapidly, I would receive messages from representatives of developing countries who said, Marian, your advice, rich countries can implement it, but we in the developing world can't. Your advice is going to distort international markets. So there I certainly realized maybe we were trying to do good, but at the same time, we were doing a bit of bad. The distinction is not that easy. Jennifer, few people have so much experience with the topic as you have. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be here and a thrill for me to be back here at the WTO in Geneva. I think I'm the only lawyer on this panel, which I'm afraid is a very dangerous place to be. But I thought I would start by bringing a little bit of a legal perspective to this debate, because it's interesting to me. Chad Bound started out by talking a little bit about anti-dumping. And to me, it is very interesting to reflect on the distinction in the GATT in terms of how they talk about and conceptualize the concerns about dumping as opposed to the concerns about subsidies. If you look at the original GATT language, Article 6 of the GATT, it talks about that dumping is to be condemned. I mean, flat out, it's a very sort of pejorative condemn the notion of dumping if it causes injury. Whereas on the subsidy side, you don't see anything like that same sort of condemnation with the possible exception of export subsidies alone, where Article 16 of the GATT immediately carved out export subsidies and said those were ones that should be avoided, or that countries should cease to grant export subsidies. And for me, this is really important as a legal matter, because it's saying right from the get-go, you can make a distinction. You can put some subsidies into one category, and you can put others, in this instance, export subsidies, into a very different category. So right from the beginning, this notion that you can distinguish. And if you go on and then look at what happened when the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures was written as part of the WTO, you had contained within that Article 8 of the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, which again, right out of the box said, we're going to say that these three categories of subsidies are considered not actionable. I mean, functionally the equivalent of a green light. You can do them with no penalties. And they put into that category research and development subsidies, regional development subsidies for disadvantaged regions, and assistance to promote the adaptation of existing facilities to new environmental regulations, new environmental requirements. Now let's just think about that. So again, early on, this notion, yes, you can put some subsidies into various boxes and other ones not into others. Now what happened, Article 8 of the GATT, Article 8 of the Subsidies Agreement, basically had its own expiration date. The members that negotiated said, well, we're going to renew it. We're going to continue it if it works well. To say that there's a green light about these three categories of subsidies, we're going to continue it. What happened at the Seattle ministerial meeting was there was no consensus to continue this carve out of these three categories of subsidies. So now we are left in a situation in which all subsidies, all industrial subsidies, are considered actionable in the sense that you can bring a countervailing duty action against them, or an adverse effects case like the Airbus Boeing case. When you then step back at it, and sort of one of the questions was, how do you do this, defining what is a good subsidy versus a bad? I mean, to me, a lot of the distinctions have been made by looking at what was the intent of the government. What did the government intend when it said we're going to do this? And what is the intent of, the United States' Build Back Better program? What is the intent of, Europe's now Global Gateway program? The problem, I will say, from an adjudicatory standpoint, when you're now trying to judge that subsidy, is a number of things. First of all, the government rarely speaks with one voice. So some members of Congress or of a parliament may say, oh, the intent of this subsidy is to do X. And someone else says, oh, no, it's to do Y. And you get stuck in this conundrum of how do you figure that out? You then also have the question of, do you really trust the government? I mean, if they know that the right thing to say is that we're doing this subsidy in order to be green, in order to support environmental development, when in fact, it is entirely about protecting a failing domestic industry or doing something else, is it okay enough that they just said the right buzzwords? And are you really in a good position to go in and second guess the government? It also raises the question of whether you're required to look at what happened in practice. Marion, this is the exact issue you got to. I mean, even if our intent was to create a good green subsidy, if the effect of it was to do just the opposite, or to develop a bad technology, or again, to create negative sort of negatives with respect to other countries, you then end up with this very significant debate. So I think the question you're asking, this sort of good, bad, and the ugly about this, is really important. And the last thing I'll comment on is in the sort of ugly category is, in my view, it is really important that we have this conversation about subsidies. I have been one of the people that's been saying for many, many years, if I had to say, what's wrong with the WTO? I mean, why are we in this state of crisis? I always say the number one reason why I think the WTO is in so much trouble from a substantive standpoint, not from a communication standpoint, not in terms of how we talk about it, but from a substance standpoint, where have the rules gotten it wrong? It's been the inability to discipline subsidies. And what that's resulted in, and this is the ugly part of this debate, is a perception that undisciplined subsidies, heavily in China, but again in other markets, have contributed to an increasingly intense view. And I would say it's more intense in the United States, maybe, but it is certainly an intense view that trade's unfair, just flat out unfair, that you're asking companies to compete not with other not market-oriented companies, but you're asking them to compete with the government of China, with the Communist Party, with a level of state intervention in the market that no individual company feels that it is fair to ask them to compete with. And it's that perception, whether it's true or not, whether it's accurate or not, that perception of unfair competition is what's undermining a lot of support for the global trading system and for the WTO as an institution.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, I'm in a bit of a bad situation. Normally, as a moderator, I always know what to say next. I'm quite used to this, but you're leaving me speechless here, the four of you. You throw so many big topics on the table that I find it difficult to keep a logical flow in the discussion. Let me try. On the one hand, Jennifer, you said, yes, we can. We have made a distinction in the, sorry, I have a noise here. Good. I have a we can make a distinction between good subsidies and bad subsidies. We thought when we wrote the subsidies agreement that we could, but apparently we didn't succeed. This lack of success, the non-well-written subsidy agreement has led to a perception of unfairness in globalization, tensions between countries, maybe. Bad subsidy agreement has led to geopolitical tensions, or Andre, is it geopolitical tensions that are leading to problems at the trade side right now? So that's one of the bigger questions. What is here the causality chain? And also your view to each of you on, can we distinguish between the good and the bad? Is there hope in case we are going to redesign at some stage the subsidy agreements, or is it simply too difficult? Chad, I follow the same order. I go first to you.
So I agree with the issues that I think everybody has raised. There's now so much for us to think about. And I think part of what we are now confronted with, and this is what I'm struggling with myself, is we have to unshackle kind of our old positions on this kind of stuff and a lot of the way that we economists especially would think about things. And I think a lot of the way that maybe even the legal community would think about this as well. And so one thing that Jennifer said, which I think was an excellent example, I also struggled with this, is the Article 8 sort of ending. And, you know, okay, so maybe we need to revisit that. There are absolutely good subsidies that we want governments to encourage. And by not articulating those, you know, there's sort of this bias that all subsidies are bad, right? And I found myself, the pandemic is the perfect example. You can't come up with a better case to make for when you should be over subsidizing certain things, just spraying money around because we don't know what's going to work. Right. And we need to diversify different candidates of vaccines because we don't know where we're going to end up on this. We need to, it's so much better to overproduce this stuff than underproduce. But convincing governments we have convinced our sort of, you know, subsidies are horrible in all situations under international trade rules. That was kind of too hard an ask. And so I'm not sure at the same time that ex ante we can fully define all of the subsidies that should be okay, given all future events, right? If we were writing the subsidy code, you know, there isn't a pandemic part. There's environment, there's R&D, but where's the pandemic vaccines part of Article 8? Jennifer, why didn't you write that? I'm kidding. Jennifer's my best friend. But anyway, this is just to say that we can't write these complete contracts ahead of time. I'm not sure what the way forward is on this. If rules maybe aren't the answer, but it needs to be a living body. Science is always evolving. We need to figure out, you know, what things to be subsidizing, what things that we used to subsidize that we realize we shouldn't be subsidizing anymore. Fossil fuels, right? The approach that we've developed just hasn't worked in this area. And I'm not sure that only thinking about things in terms of rules and trying to redline out everything from a legal perspective is the way to go. Again, I agree. And I agree with everything that Justin said about the need to discipline subsidies and how they will get overused, abused as a form of protection. But at the same time, in other instances, as we've seen over the last 2 years, the failure to subsidize can actually create, tragedies as well. And we need to balance those things.
Wow, that doesn't make things easier. So not being able to discipline subsidies is, according to Jennifer, the biggest weakness maybe of the multilateral trading system. Chad is telling us we should not only think about how to discipline subsidies, but we must have a certain freedom to use them in situations that we cannot foresee. Maybe it's too difficult to design this kind of rules. We need a living body of rules. I don't think the WTO legal texts are something that we would call a living body of legal texts. If we want to get there, then we would start to become more dynamic in our negotiation processes. But I can tell you that the OECD has recently developed a body of legal text, a recommendation, voluntary, but it is very relevant in my view for the discussion we are having here. That legal text gives guidance on how countries should, within their own countries, think about how government support can distort and how they should think about designing it for it not to be distortive, including in situations of crisis as the one we have developed, experienced now. That work comes from the competition committee and therefore represents the collaboration, the outcome of collaboration between competition authorities. So maybe those authorities know how to move on. Justin, from Beijing, what's your view on this difficult topic? Can we design rules? Should we design rules? What should these rules look like? Do we need to redesign the rules that exist?
I like to come back to the issue of the state-owned enterprises, because Andres and Jennifer both mentioned about the state-owned enterprises in China, and I consider them to receive a large amount of subsidies and causing all kinds of trouble for the international trading systems. And Jennifer also mentioned at the end, she does not know this is because of perception or because of realities. And from my understanding, the issue is most of perception instead of realities. I just published an article on a journal called the Structural Change and Dynamic Growth on the state-owned enterprises, in China. And so I know the issue, quite well. Basically, the state-owned enterprises in China can be put into 3 types of categories. The first one on the competitive sectors. And they are competing with the private sectors in China, like the steel industry and so on, or also some machine building industries. And the second one is on the natural monopoly sectors, like power, telecommunication, as well as the railway system, highway system. They are in natural monopolies. And the third type is in the strategic sectors related to the national security, national defense. For the first type, the competitive sectors, they do not receive whatsoever subsidies at all because they are competing with the private sectors. And some of them are profitable. They continue to grow. Some of them, if they lose money, they will be privatized or go bankrupt. And for the second type, the monopoly sectors, they are profitable. They do not require subsidies at all. And some of them are the major source of the government revenues. So if you look carefully, there's no subsidy to them at all. And then for the stereotype, they are very capital intensive, they are very advanced. They are not China's competitive advantages. Yes, they receive subsidies, but most subsidies from the state budget, just like in any other country. You go to European country or you will go to the US, for the national security sectors, certainly they receive subsidies. And if there are some possibilities, and the second, they do not do export. And they like to have import, but they could not have import because the advanced country will not sell those kind of technology to China. But China certainly, has the need of national securities. So if we, look carefully, what China do relate to the subsidies of the state-owned sectors. It's very similar to what European country are doing. European country also subsidize their national security sectors, and a lot of them are state-owned enterprises. In the US, I know most of those firms are private owned, but again, they are also subsidized. So under this kind of situation, I think, yes, there's a lot of perception about subsidy and so on, but I think it's not realities. I think there's some kind of pressure from China. It's because of China, it's growing so fast. China upgrade the industry so fast, but most of those kind of upgrading are in the competitive sectors, they are not receive subsidies. I do not mean that everything in China is perfect, but if there are some violation of the WTO rules, I think the best way is to go to the appellation court to be judged by the facts instead of trying to do the policies and so on based on the perception. And from what I see, those kind of perception mostly are not the facts. And I do think that, certainly we need to have some kind of rule-based competition. And we also need to design the rules based on the economic principles. If the subsidy is to compensate for the first mover in the process of industrial upgrading or structural transformation, I think those are desirable. But those kind of subsidies should be short-term, and the best way should be a tax break for a number of years. And it will stop automatically by the time the time expires. And if we can have some kind of consideration of externality, certainly now we talk about the green growth, and we may need to give some incentive for people to adopt green technologies, and those kind of things should also be well defined. And talk about emergency needs of PPE and those kind of things. I think the best way is not to produce everything by yourself. I think the best way is to improve the function of international trade, and the best way is to revital the function of WTO, and so we can have much better cooperation and to improve the efficiency instead of going back to some kind of protective cross economy.
Thank you, Justin. So a question here, is there only a perception of distortion in global markets, or are there facts that can prove that there are distortions going on? Because if it's perceptions rather than facts, that would lead to very different outcomes under existing rules and in a possible dispute. But then also interesting, Justin calling for abiding to the rules and judging by the rules, existing rules. Chad had asked the question, can we even design rules for all the and eventualities that may arise? So what kind of rules? We go back to this question, what kind of rules? And I would have another question, Andre. When I listen to Justin, this sounds very much like my economics classes in my undergraduates in a pretty mainstream economics university some decades ago. When you listen to these different points of view that are quite different, I'm finding on this panel, from Washington, from Beijing, from Geneva, from lawyers, from economists. André, how would you want to continue this discussion?
Well, Marion, I would say there is a great job for you at the OECD to put some facts. I mean, we have heard a lot about perception, and I think there is perception clearly in the US that the US in a situation of unfair competition vis-a-vis China and also vis-a-vis Europe in part because of subsidies. We in Europe feel the same thing. Partly about China, but also partly about the US. And you know, when you listen to public debates in Europe about the fact that the US is well ahead compared to Europe in some digital technologies, there are always people who are bringing, you know, the US military and, you know, various sort of subsidies coming through different channels in the US. And I think we heard from Justin, and which I can understand as well, the fact that, you know, China was lagging behind, and we in Europe and in the US through various programs historically we subsidized all kinds of sectors, and you know, and aircraft is certainly one of those cases, Airbus and Boeing. And you know, why should China not be allowed to do the same thing? So that's exactly sort of the non-cooperative situation that we are finding ourselves. And it seems to me that one of the ways to make progress in this difficult situation and is to try to go beyond the perception and to put some facts. And I think the work that OECD did in the past and continues to do to some extent in agriculture certainly helped us the international community make progress. And you said, you know, Marion, that there's still a lot of subsidy in agriculture, but at least we know what we are talking about. We know what subsidies there are, and one can sit down and negotiate about them and try to find some disciplines. We are not there in other domains, in other subsidies. And by the way, in services, we don't even have discipline at all, right? In the text of the GATS, you know, countries could not agree on negotiating subsidies there. So I think to bring some facts and for OECD to do what it did for agriculture, obviously China would need to agree to participate in this exercise, and you know, but I think it would be extremely useful. Second thing and last thing, I think we have to be also modest. To what we can achieve in a WTO, in a multinational context, sort of a global context. Issues of subsidies in Europe is not easy to tame, but when you look at the world system, I think it's harder. And what is a good subsidy? That in itself, what is a good activity? That is not trivial. We are all talking about green now, but there's a lot of greenwashing, and there are genuine also disagreements about what constitutes good activities and not good activities. Is nuclear power, civilian power, is it a good activity? Is it a bad activity? Just follow the discussion in some countries in Europe, and you'll get very, very heated discussion, genuine discussion. So I think we have to be modest, but at least to have the facts and to know what is actually going on. Where are really the main problems? To what extent are SOEs in China creating a problem for the partners of China? We don't really know, right? We know a number of cases, but is it a huge problem? Is it mainly a problem of perception? I think that is something that needs to be really objectivized.
Thank you, Andrea. I will give Jennifer the possibility to react to this, but allow me to say something about indeed the certain exercises of measuring, of generating facts that have been taking place at the OECD. You said on agriculture, we know what is going on. Yes, our figures have shown, for instance, that in some OECD countries, the support, the financial support to the agricultural sector represents as much as 100% of the value added. So that means we double the return to producers with the support we give. That's big. On the industrial sectors, and these are the sectors that we have been discussing more prominently, we have been working on two sectors in the past at OECD, the aluminium sector and the semiconductor sector. And also there, from the information we were able to gather, we have the impression that there is an important amount of government support, and that support often takes the form of below market finance support. And this brings me to add an additional layer of complexity to this. We mentioned already trade policy making constituency. We mentioned competition authorities. To which extent are we entering with subsidies into the area of the finance ministries? And will this level of complexity help us to find any solution at all? Before you answer, Jennifer, one of the questions from I'm getting here through the Q&A is, does the agricultural agreement help us in any way? And you seem to be suggesting that thinking about something like green, amber, red could help us. What are your views on the way forward? Maybe 2-3 minutes before I give each panelist a possibility to make a final statement.
Well, thank you very much. And I will try to be very quick. I'm going to pick up on 2 points. I'll try to answer the question on the agriculture agreement. Does it help in any way? And I'll start with that one because I think the answer is yes. And that is that I think there were two important aspects of the agriculture agreement that we could think about now importing onto the industrial subsidy side of the table. One is the concept of an overall cap. That again, that you just set some basic number that governments will not spend more than X amount in total on subsidies. And to me, we need to think about whether we need to start worrying about this because the concern I would have as we're watching, again, this Build Back Better program in the United States, this Build Back Better World program at the G7, like I said, the Global Gateway and other programs within Europe, whether we're ready to start another, if you will, arms race in subsidies where Europe grants one. And so then the United States responds. And then Japan says, well, we need to be in that technology. And we're back where we ended up in the agriculture area where everybody feels they've got to subsidize their producers in order to compete with somebody else that's subsidized. We are in danger of running down that road. And so the issue that, might be a way to solve it is to think about that agriculture subsidy notion of an overall cap. Just nobody can spend more than this amount. And whether the cap comes down over time or not is something that could be debated. And the second concept that you could presumably import from the agriculture subsidy is this notion that certain subsidies are green lighted, meaning they're not actionable. And whether or not they count for the cap is something you would really need to think about, but that there would be some that would be considered good subsidies. And again, we'd spend a lot of time thinking about how to define that. But I think at some basic level, you come back to the notion that there are clearly subsidies that are generating a global good, whether that's a vaccine, whether that is, ways to adapt to climate change. There could be clearly some general senses of those that fall into that green category. Then you have the amber or yellow subsidies. And again, those are ones that are just considered actionable. In other words, they're not good or bad. They're neutral unless they cause competitive distortions, unless they cause injury, unless they do harm affirmatively in a way that can be proven, in which case there can be actions taken against them. And then over on the right side, the red, if you will, are the subsidies that are considered a priori distortive. I mean, those are the export subsidies. And again, we may put fossil fuel subsidies or other things that are pushing against the global good, that are harming the global good. You put those into that category. Now, I am not Pollyanna. This would not be easy to do, but it at least is conceptually things that you could draw out of the agriculture agreement that I think might make sense if we're going to go down this road of everybody re-engaging in industrial policies and industrial subsidies. And the second thing I want to comment on is this perception versus reality, because here again, I think part of the problem is the fact that we just don't know. And I certainly would commend to everyone the OECD study on aluminum and on semiconductors, because that is the first place in which we really do actually have facts on the table. And the facts are pretty disturbing in terms of the level of subsidies and what they are doing. But the problem is the WTO is supposed to be involved in helping on this issue of cataloging the amount of subsidies. And what's the problem? Everybody is way behind on their notifications. I mean, you have 58 members of the WTO that are more than 5 years behind in notifying their subsidies. And the other problem with it is countries are only notifying the subsidies that they believe are subsidies. So again, you have a huge dispute over whether, I think many countries would say, I don't have to notify that because I don't think it's a subsidy. I don't think it fits within the definition of a financial contribution by a government or public body that confers a benefit and is specific. So if it doesn't fit into that box, I'm not going to notify. And that is a self-judging matter. So every country gets to decide whether they think it's a subsidy and therefore whether it needs to be notified. So this whole issue of having notifications, we are going to need a lot more of an objective process to get down to the facts of, kind of where the subsidies are before we can begin to figure out whether or not they are, in fact, distortive of competition. And at the end of the day, that's the real test of whether or not they are good, bad, or indifferent, is whether they are distortive of fair competition. I mean, at the end of the day, that's where you have to come down.
Thank you, Jennifer. We should stop in 3 minutes. I will give each of you 1 minute, so we will go over time a little bit to make a final comment. One of the questions that came in is, does the Ascm agreement need to be revamped? I think under the Doha negotiations, the WTO has a mandate, has been encouraged to start renegotiating this agreement. Nothing has happened so far. My final question is, how urgent is it to do something? And what would be the thing to do in the next 12 months? 1 minute each. I follow the same order. Chad.
So my last comment would be, I want to fight with Jennifer again. And we fought this internally in our 2019 paper on subsidies and such, because I agree with her and disagree with her. I don't think we disagree. But this issue of defining subsidies is critical, and yet I'm not sure there is an answer. And I would also highlight the OECD reports. And so to Marion's question, what should folks be doing? The OECD should be doing more. We need to give them a mandate to do more of what they did on semiconductors, what they've done for 2 decades on agriculture, what they did on aluminum over the industrial landscape to help us get the facts out there on the table. But the issue is, and especially when we think about China, what the OECD research has shown is that you can't just look for government payments from, this to that to show the subsidies. No, it's a combination of a lot of different things. It can be policies, right? Policies in the aluminum report on the aluminum supply chain, restricting upstream production, export restrictions creates downstream subsidies, right?
Chad,
that doesn't really fit our normal.
You hear me?
Yep.
1 minute.
You can't hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Anyway, this is just a plug. The OECD reports, I'm not sure we can define it. We're going to need lots of economic analysis and evidence to make progress in this area to get the facts on the table.
Thank you, Chad. And I would like to make a public statement here. I did not write Chad's speaking notes, but thank you, Chad. Justin, 1 minute for you.
Thank you very much. I think we need to have a facts-based system. We need to have a rule-based system. We also need to have a multilateral, international systems. And for that to happen, I think we need to have more studies and more also, to have more debate like this. But before we can have that, I think the most urgent things for us is to resume the work of appellate court at WTO. So if we have some disagreement, we can make the case there. And instead of trying to use actions on the individual country or bilateral ways, and that will give us more time to find out the facts and to come up with some kind of agreement which are acceptable for the goods of everyone.
Thank you, Justin. Facts, rules, multilateralism, and a revived appellate body. Andre, 1 minute for you.
I'm also on the facts, as I already said. I think we need more facts and less perception in this discussion. That's number one. I think number two, when we will have the facts, I can see two directions for reform of the subsidies rules that have both already been mentioned. One is indeed a carve out that is, you know, the three colors, red, green, amber. I think that would be very much desirable. We have something of that sort in the European Union with the state aid rules. You know, those, everything is forbidden except what is allowed, and there is a list of activities or that are allowed, subsidies that are judged as being good subsidies. And the third issue is the SOEs. I think that the issue of China in the WTO needs to be discussed more seriously. I think we cannot have a situation where we have the largest exporter in the world that has, to some extent, rules that are different from other countries. And, you know, I don't want to harmonize economic system. I mean, China is very much entitled to have its own economic system. And moreover, it has been a very successful economic system. So I would be the last one to tell China to change its economic system. But I think that system needs to be more compatible with the spirit of the WTO. And I think the area of state-owned enterprises is certainly one that does deserve great attention. Thank you.
Thanks you, Andre. We are 3 minutes over time already. Some support for the 3 boxes, Jennifer, the discussion of state-owned enterprise. We really don't have more than 1 minute before we end the session with some clapping. Jennifer, you're concluding 1 minute.
Okay, my 1 minute is the best solution would be a revision of the WTO rules on subsidies and countervailing measures. However, I do not think that can be done very quickly. And so the immediate urgent need is to, I think, resolve what I see as a huge conflict between this idea that if we don't do something, we could end up with this race of subsidies rising, compared to the concerns that the subsidy rules will push governments to be not big enough, not bold enough in their efforts to fight climate change, particularly the massive amount of investments we need to make in fighting for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and the massive amount of investments that we need in increased vaccine production and distribution. So on the one hand, my message is go big and go bold in the direction of resolving these absolutely urgent problems facing the world, and at the same time spend some time thinking about how to not end up in a subsidies arms race with one another.
Thank you, Jennifer. So your call for making sure that, yes, we should move urgently. Let's be aware that what we think is good may also be bad, and that is a risk of things to become ugly. I will not try to summarize this session, but I invite those of you in the room in room W to clap and to applaud the panelists. Thank you for the discussion here. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Justin. And thanks, Jennifer. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye to all.
Thank you.